IEA channel. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And before we get started, I'd just like to take this opportunity to remind you that you can subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel or our podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean if you're listening rather than watching us today. The national lockdown was introduced for an initial 3-week period back in March. Over 6 months later, vast swathes of the country are living under local lockdowns, and the rest of the country seems to be constantly hovering on the verge of entering into one. Joining me to discuss this seemingly never-ending lockdown limbo today are Julian Jessop, Economics Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Sam Bowman, who's Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics. Thanks very much for joining me, gentlemen. Before the viewers and listeners start experiencing deja vu, don't worry, we have been here before. The three of us did join very much in the same fashion, probably even in the same rooms, to gather virtually to discuss lockdown back in April, and yet the issues haven't gone away. They've just been joined by new ones. The newest of those restrictions come from Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon's imposing new measures, which she went to great lengths to point out are not a lockdown, but acknowledge that they would be considered by some a backward step. The measures include a ban on the sale of alcohol indoors in pubs and restaurants and a ban on serving anything, including food, after 6 o'clock. But she stressed that schools and hospitality will stay open. So is the idea of this kind of circuit breaker a good one? The argument being that it prevents a more stringent lockdown later on? Julian, what do you think?
Well, I think we're starting to see some of the limitations of local lockdowns. In principle, these sort of targeted measures are exactly the right way ahead. I mean, we clearly don't want a second national lockdown, as we saw in March, which crashed the economy and had all sorts of other adverse effects on people's welfare as well. So we clearly want to avoid that. But I'm not sure that local lockdowns are the silver bullet people are looking for. There's going to be at least two problems with them. First of all, it actually is quite hard to target them. If, for example, you shut down a particular city area, what's to stop people from traveling just a little bit further to go to a pub or a restaurant? And of course, people commute in and out of cities as well. So what we're seeing that across the central band of Scotland, but also in places like Nottinghamshire. Even though you only really want to target the cities, you end up having to lock down much larger areas. I think the second problem with this is the lack of confidence that people have in these measures, partly because they're so difficult to communicate. Again, in principle, it's easy to find out what the measures are in your local area. Most local authorities have done a good job of providing information here. But for many people, that does seem to be hard to do. And there's a lack of clarity about what the strategy is. So it does seem odd that you have one set of policies in one postcode and a completely different set of policies in another. And in the back of all of this, where is the evidence for this? I'm quite persuadable that all of the steps the government has taken are reasonable, but I'd like to see the evidence for that, a sort of comprehensive cost-benefit analysis or impact assessment, as you'd have with almost any other government intervention of this type. And without that information, I think that sort of adds to the uncertainty and lack of clarity about what's going on.
I suppose it makes it easier for people to disbelieve it as well if they're being told, oh, it does work honest, and you sort of go, well, how do we know? Sam, do you think what's happening in Scotland is a good idea?
I think that it's probably a mixture of good and bad ideas. One thing that I'm really distressed by in general about the conversation that we have about coronavirus measures is that there's an assumption or an implicit assumption that there are two options. There's business as usual or a lockdown. And I think the real lesson should be from this year that actually somewhere in between is probably optimal or is probably ideal. And we were doing quite well over the summer. We did, and to be fair, it was the summer, so people were outdoors more often and so on. But it was only around August when suddenly the government decided it was time to get back to normal, encouraging people to go back to the office. There were headlines suggesting that people would be fired if they refused to go back into the office. The rush to get people back into schools, I think hugely misguided reopening of the universities and desire to bring students onto campus at universities, the eat out to help out, which I think probably did at the margin not help, but people disagree, and we can disagree about that and argue about that later maybe. But there seem to be so many things that we could be doing short of a lockdown to slow down the spread, and perhaps even to keep the spread, the R0 below 1, so we're not experiencing exponential spread, that we're not doing. And so little of the conversation seems to be about what are the best measures like that to take. And so when we do have measures brought in by the government and by the Scottish government, often they seem, to me at least, to not be the ones that necessarily seem obvious to slow down the spread most of all. So the 10 p.m. curfew, I'm not really convinced that that's going to make a huge difference. I think it's possible that that could make things worse by packing everybody out onto public transport at the same time, banning restaurants from selling alcohol. Okay, maybe there's an enforcement point. I'm not completely clear why pubs can't serve outdoors, for example. I'm not completely clear why alcohol is the key thing, even in Scotland. And I'm just very distressed that we're sleepwalking back into a lockdown because we're not having this conversation, and we're not thinking about the kind of weird and sometimes very counterintuitive things that we might do to slow the spread enough that we can suppress the spread of the virus such that we don't need a lockdown until we get to sort of spring, Marchish, when hopefully we'll be able to reevaluate the vaccine situation and maybe thinking about then getting back to normal.
Okay, well, I mean, the IEA was founded to think the unthinkable. So what kind of measures do you mean then, Sam? Because, I mean, I'd like to get back to life to normal-ish, and if that means doing a few odd, slightly unusual things to facilitate that in a way that makes it much more safe for people, I'm all ears. So what would you tell the government to do instead?
I mean, I would first of all say we just cannot get back to normal until the spring. There is, I agree with you. The more normal we can be, the better. One thing, for example, is I think that reopening the schools probably has been a mistake, and I believe looking at countries that were experiencing rapid spread earlier in the year, school closures, I think the evidence is pretty strong, were quite a good way of slowing down the spread. Having said that, I understand that it's very difficult for people who have young children at home, both for them and for the children who want to see other kids and so on. So I don't know why we haven't considered sort of small teaching bubbles where, let's say, the government pays one parent to look after 5 kids who effectively form a sort of remote teaching kind of group for the duration. So they do get to be around other kids, they do get to spend some time with their friends, they are doing some remote teaching, and they are under supervision of an adult who's being paid. Now, maybe there are good reasons against that, but I haven't seen it considered. And that could be a much, much less high-risk way of getting kids somewhere back to education and performing some of the childcare roles that school performs. Let's face it. I mean, for to a large extent, school is about childcare, not just about education. I think that we should be open to the idea of shutting down roads altogether and effectively giving the roads to restaurants and bars as outdoor seating areas, not just letting them sit on the pavement, but actually shutting down, stopping cars from going down those roads and saying, tough luck, sorry. This is for the next few months, congestion is going to be a problem and you're going to have to spend quite a lot of time in your car if you want to drive around. But the reason that we're doing this is to say that bars and restaurants can have much more floor space outside. Actually, if I were the government, I'd be subsidizing space heaters. I would be doing pretty much everything we possibly can, given that we know that aerosol spread now is one of the major ways that the virus is transmitted, which explains why seemingly outdoor activity is much safer, seemingly, than indoor activity. Stuff like that, I think, would have made a much bigger difference in the long run and been much less risky than Eat Out to Help Out was, where we basically paid people to go and cram themselves indoors into not very well ventilated restaurants. I think there are loads of things that we should be doing around the borders. I'd be much, much more interested in, for example, rules that stop people from using public transport when they come back from the airport. I'd be very, very interested in mandatory quarantine rules. I know it sounds very authoritarian, but a lockdown is more authoritarian, and we're in a very, very bad world of kind of third and fourth bests at the moment. And I would be enforcing mask use much, much, much more strongly. I mean, even today, I was just chatting to a friend who was on the London Overground and was saying that, he was seeing maybe 50% mask use. Maybe because people think that it's not as dangerous when they're overground or something like that. I don't understand. But we know mask use now has a significant effect on the spread. We know that these things do slow down the spread of the virus. And to me, as somebody who doesn't want another lockdown and agrees that the cost of lockdown is very high, these are things that really people who oppose lockdowns should be the strongest advocates of measures like these, because without them, we are going to have another lockdown. And just one final point. When we talk about lockdown, we assume that it's a government-imposed lockdown. But in fact, what we have learned is that people will individually lock themselves down if the virus is spreading, and people will individually choose not to go out, not to go to work, not to spend money when the virus is endemic outside their houses. So when we talk about lockdown, we should be clear that we're not just talking about a government-mandated lockdown. We also could be talking about if a virus is endemic and if the virus is spreading around the country, the economy will shut down anyway. The economy will shut down whether or not the government tells us to stay at home. And those are the kinds of outcomes that we should be stopping. So really, I mean, whether the government acts or not on a lockdown, what we should be trying to avoid is the virus spreading so much that people either want a government mandated lockdown or impose it on themselves.
Well, Julian, you've noted that obviously the people imposed lockdown, I suppose, as Sam mentions, that actually came before the government mandated lockdown in March. We were seeing reduced footfall, reduced use of public transport, all that kind of thing. Sam's also right that we're in a kind of third or fourth best situation. In normal times, this is beyond the pale. You know, we wouldn't be suggesting anything of this sort. But what do you think about the suggestions Sam's making there that mean that, you know, we wouldn't need as stringent government intervention, but actually we could suppress the virus anyway?
Yeah, well, a number of points though. First of all, you're right that economic activity, things like footfall, started to fall sharply before the official lockdown was introduced on the 23rd of March. But actually, there was an event before then that was also very significant, which was on the 16th of March. The Prime Minister made an advisory announcement. So this wasn't formally backed by law at the time, but that basically was advising people to stay at home, to avoid travel, to avoid restaurants and pubs. And so in a sense, it was actually government action, in this case, government words that triggered the sharp drop-off in economic activity to begin with. But more generally, first of all, I think Sam's clearly far more on top of the detail of this than I am. And I listened to his ideas, and I think they all made sense. I particularly like the idea of, you know, closing roads to give restaurants more open-air space to serve people. That sounds like
I understand the argument, but as someone who lives very close to Vauxhall Bridge right now, I'm not in favour of closing any roads, because the congestion and ability to get around is impossible. But I mean, that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider the argument, weigh up the pros and cons. And
that's a good example of where, you know, local level decision making would be the right thing to do, because clearly, you know, a civil servant in Whitehall or Westminster isn't best placed to decide whether to lock a particular road in Nottingham or Leicester, but maybe, you know, local authorities and local decision makers could look at that sort of thing. The more general point I wanted to focus on, though, is if you like, the bigger picture, and the two key points here. First of all, if we're wanting people to make their own judgments, then we need to provide them with better information, or as good information as possible. And I think the government, at least sometimes at the local level, has made huge strides on this. In my area, for example, there's a very good council website that you can look at that tells you pretty much what's going on in the local area. And so providing more information there, I think, will make it easier for people to make their own judgments. There have, of course, been some big backward steps here. Things like the farce over test and trace and the Excel spreadsheet cock up, those sorts of things are undermining confidence. But the more you can provide good information, the better. And the second thing that related to that, if you want people to obey the rules, then you need to explain them more clearly. I'm struck by the example of that Sam gave just then of people not wearing masks on overground trains because they think they're less vulnerable or less likely to infect other people than underground trains. That clearly is nonsense. But I think to maintain public consent, you need to explain what you're doing a lot better. I think Keir Starmer was perfectly right in PMQs the other day to ask the government, would it be publishing the explanation of the 10 p.m. curfew for pubs, which...
I mean, as our colleague Chris Snowden, I mean, as soon as it was announced, he said, where is the evidence for this 10 p.m. curfew? Or have you just gone, oh, well, they had a curfew in Belgium, we'll try that?
Yes, it just seemed very odd. I mean, as again, as Sam said, it's sort of, concertinas, all the people spilling out onto the streets to 10 o'clock. It removes the discretion to stagger different types of activity. It just diverts activity from one place to another. And as the hospitality industry itself has said, actually, in many cases, pubs are pretty much on top of the social distancing rules and so on. That's almost as safe a place to be as any, depending on the circumstances. So there may well be a decent case here. And, I'd like to think that because the government has made the decision to impose a 10 p.m. curfew, they have a good evidence-based framework for doing that, proper cost-benefit analysis and a decent assessment. But in the absence of that being communicated to the general public, we have to go on the word of, whoever's giving the press conference of the day. And, maybe that might have worked in the early stages of the lockdown when confidence in the government was still fairly high. But for one reason or another, as we know, confidence in the government is now pretty low.
I think members of the SAGE advisory group have also confirmed that they were not asked to model the impact of the 10 p.m. curfew. So, we can keep asking for the evidence on that, but I don't think it's going to be forthcoming. Last month, my colleague Emily Carver spoke to Steve Davis and the Spectator's Kate Andrews about local lockdowns and whether they were the way forward. But yesterday, the leaders of Leeds, Manchester and Newcastle city councils wrote to the health secretary saying that the current measures are not working. Manchester and the Northwest in particular have been under local lockdown since late July, but cases are rising. But those leaders added that we want to be clear, we do not support further economic lockdown because they're very aware of the impact that is having on their local economy and on jobs. The argument made by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, is that the rules are too complex, practically unenforceable because they differ from postcode to postcode, and that there's a conflict between local and national messaging. You're right, Julian, many local authorities have done a great job, but when the national government is saying another thing, people just get confused and say, oh, well, I don't know what's going on, I'm just going to use my common sense. But unfortunately, people's common sense is different from person to person. Is that an argument, in fact, against local lockdowns and just asking everyone in the country to follow the same rules? I mean, it would be much less nuanced and less targeted, but if it were easier for people to understand, would that make compliance higher, do you think?
Well, it's always about trade-offs, isn't it? I think that, yes, that would help in one respect. Everybody would know what the rules are and would find them easier to follow. But on the other hand, would it be proportionate to the problem? If you're in a far-flung rural area in the southwest where the case numbers are extremely low, why should you be expected to follow the same rules as somebody in an inner city area in the north of England? And I think that would be, yes, I mean that would hit one problem, but it would be a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So I'm against that. On the point about evidence that local lockdowns aren't working, I mean, it is true that, even in those areas where there are local lockdowns, the number of infections have risen sharply. But of course, there's the classic problem here of the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened without those lockdowns. And this is a problem that's sort of been bedeviling cost-benefit analysis of the lockdowns all the way through. On the one hand, you might be tempted to say, look, if we don't have a national lockdown, then the entire sky will fall in. And then if the entire sky doesn't fall in, you say, aha, the lockdown works. And that would clearly be silly. But if you had been fearing an exponential rise in the number of infections, and a number of infections hasn't risen exponentially, but it's continued to edge up, I wouldn't conclude from that fact alone that the lockdown hasn't worked. It may well be that without the lockdown, things would have been an awful lot worse. So this is very hard, and that's where the science, I think, needs to be better communicated sometimes than it has. But overall, I think it's fair to say that local lockdowns and local measures are the right way to go in principle. But as we're finding all the time, in practice, it isn't the silver bullet that some people hoped it would be.
Well, also these local leaders are arguing that while these lockdowns are local in implementation, they are not local in where the decisions are being made. It's still the man in Whitehall telling local areas what to do, rather than them being able to decide for themselves. Should also note as well that, in areas like Manchester, for example, half of new cases are coming from university students who have moved into the area regardless of the lockdown. So it might not be a failure in the lockdown. It might be the hundreds of thousands of freshers you've imported and then put in blocks to share, communal spaces. Sam, what do you think about, the trade-off between a clear national message and a nuanced local one?
I don't really know that there should be a trade-off. I think you're right that there probably is, in fact, a trade-off right now. It's bizarre to me that, for example, as far as I know, there's still not a single website you can go to and put in your postcode to find out what the rules are around you. I know the Times made one. It took the Times a week or two to do it, and still the government hasn't done it. As far as I can tell, there isn't a single web page you can go to that will just tell you all of the current rules and all of the current advice. It's spread all across various different departments and pages. So even in terms of national advice, it's quite difficult to figure out what exactly you're supposed to do. And I quite like the idea of the sort of traffic light system where you have 3 or 4 different sets of rules and say, well, unfortunately, Lambeth is in amber rather than green, so you can't eat indoors, you can't drink in pubs indoors, things like that. Or if somewhere is in red, we're shutting places down altogether. I think that the downside of a local lockdown is that clearly, as both of you have said, the virus doesn't respect local authority boundaries, and all it really takes is 1 or 2 people moving from one authority to another to continue the spread. And since we aren't, and I think rightly, aren't banning people from leaving their homes, it's hard to say that a local lockdown is a kind of foolproof measure. But clearly the spread of an exponential virus is partially and to a large extent determined by how many contacts the average person has. Given that a lot of spread is done by people who don't know that they have the virus, the average contact of the average person is very, very important. And to the extent that local lockdowns can change that, I think that's great. It sounds as if, from what I've heard, at least anecdotally, in places like Manchester, especially in the city, people just are completely ignoring the rules. People are drinking outdoors. They're not being enforced. So in that case, you kind of wonder, well, even if there is a kind of a slight reduction in people's average number of contacts with each other, what really good is this doing? But I think you really hit on kind of a key point when you talked about university students. To me, so many of the causes of this recent rise have been self-inflicted. Another one I forgot to mention is holidays. Allowing people, and I should say, I did leave the country. I took tests on both sides and so on, and also quarantined. But the rules that the government brought in over the summer, or the kind of messaging and rules that the government brought in over the summer on a whole host of areas, all of which you would think would individually increase the spread, I think have been self-inflicted injury after self-inflicted injury after self-inflicted injury. I don't know what they were thinking. And to a large extent, what we're doing now is trying to deal with and put out the fires that were caused in July and August. It could be that if we are clever in the kind of targeted measures we bring in around bars and restaurants and looking after kids and things like that, we can avoid this big repeat of lockdown. But my fear is that as soon as we go back to low case numbers, yet again, the government will say, oh, it's time to go back to normal, everything's good again, and we'll just be here again in January, February. And that's a best case scenario. The worst case scenario is we don't get to control these numbers, they continue to rise. I think yesterday, we had another doubling of cases in a week. They're not doubling every single week, but they are doubling over certain weeks. So I'm quite concerned about the rise. And one thing that people seem to forget is at the beginning of February, we had, I think, approximately 0 cases, maybe a very small handful of cases that we didn't pick up on at the time. And by the end of March, so 2 months later, we were in full-scale lockdown, and we were having hundreds and then thousands of people die every day. This is really a very, very rapidly spreading virus. It's a very rapidly changing situation. And the huge thing, the thing that basically most people, I think, haven't internalized is how quickly this can change and how quickly these spreads can turn around. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the next few weeks we go into lockdown for a few weeks, hopefully only a few weeks. And then after that, the question will be, how do we avoid this ever happening again?
It's an incredibly complex and nuanced at the same time discussion. Is there anything else about the lockdown situation that you both want to add before we wind up? Sam thinks we're going to have a national lockdown or some form of it in the coming weeks because we simply can't get it under control. Julian, what
I'm known as an optimist, and I sort of wanted to conclude with two positive points.
Please cheer me up.
The first is that throughout this period, as far as we know, the economy is actually continuing to recover at a pretty decent pace. So I think that's important and positive. Obviously, this is first and foremost a health crisis, but deep and prolonged economic recessions have huge welfare costs as well, not least the prospect of a surge in unemployment. So the fact that the economy is gradually getting back to normal, I think, is positive, and I think that partly reflects the flexibility of our economy and the ingenuity of the people involved in it. We were talking before the call about the example of the couple in Essex who had a drive-in wedding with 250 guests, obeying all the social distancing rules. So people find a way to behave sensibly, to get on with their lives, even under the constraints they're currently under. The second point is obviously isn't really my field. I'm an economist, not a health expert, but those people that look at the NHS far more closely than I do say it is better prepared for a second wave than it was for the first wave. The treatments are better. So I think the health fallout from a second wave, which was always inevitable anyway, hopefully those costs will be less than would otherwise have been the case, and that in turn, of course, reduces the need for social and economic lockdown measures to counterbalance those costs. So there are two potential positives then. The economy is continuing to recover reasonably well, and we're probably better prepared in health terms for a second wave than we would otherwise have been. But there's clearly all sorts of uncertainties out there, and we're facing a very difficult minimum of several months ahead of us.
This is very true. I wish I could bring it to a more optimistic end, but I think in basic summary, there are many possible pitfalls that lie in the months ahead, and we'll just have to do our best not to fall into them, I think is the only way I can sum it up. Julian, Sam, thank you very much for joining me, and thanks for listening or watching today. Don't forget, as I said at the beginning, you can subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel and listen to our podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean. You can check out all of the IEA's work on our website, iea.org.uk, and if you like the work that we're doing, while you're on there, you can support us by making a donation. Thanks very much.